Hello, this is Mr. Griffin. I actually got an idea or request a while back from one of my YouTube subscribers that liked my TNA knockouts of WWE Divas, the best of the best video. And he asked, are you planning on doing anything concerning tag teams? And I didn't have the idea at the time. And sorry if I didn't credit the YouTuber that told me. I don't exactly have it up right now as I'm recording my voice. But I had the idea. I was like, okay, I could do that. Now, let me say this up front. This isn't a ranking. This is a talk about, you know, some of the top tag teams. I'm sure I will miss a few. But this is just a discussion of tag team wrestling, which has pretty much become a lost art. Because there's very, 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 very few real tag teams now. In anywhere. WWE, it's non-existent. TNA's tag team division, which at one point was one of the best out there, as a shambles. The only one with any decent tag team work right now is ROH. But, you know, they're not that visible, so most people don't know about it. But I'm not going to discuss the state of tag team wrestling today, at least not at length. I'm here to discuss the ones that made us love tag teams and tag team wrestling. First, I will start off with Bruiser and Crusher, which simply was Dick the Bruiser and Crusher Walter Solowski. They were a big-time tag team in the Midwest, in Milwaukee, during the 60s and I think 70s as well. They were always the tag team, whether it's face or heel, that Vern Gagne, who ran the American Wrestling Association, or AWA, out there, would call on to really sell, you know, his cards, especially in the Midwest. In particular, when they would go against like Nick Bockwinkel and Ray the Crippler Stevens, or the Texas Outlaws of Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch. They were pretty much sold out. In fact, one of their last matches was actually where they put over another tag team, which I'll be discussing at length later, that you might have heard of. I believe they go by the name the Road Warriors. But Bruiser and Crusher, while great individually, they were legendary as a tag team, especially out in the Wisconsin area. Well, speaking of, I mentioned one of their old rivals was Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch, and that's the next tag team I will discuss. Before Dick Murdoch became Dirty Dick Murdoch or Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch, he was tag team partners with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, live in living color, baby. Dusty Rhodes, I mean, started out pretty much as a heel. And he and Dick Murdoch were like two of the biggest heels ever in wrestling. I mean, they were pretty much one of the dirtiest and best tag teams to draw heat, and made a lot of money together. Of course, Rhodes would go on to his biggest success as a fan favorite and as a singles wrestler, but him and Murdoch were still pretty legendary. So legendary that their names still would come up even years after they have teamed. Of course, Dusty Rhodes was known for his charisma, his brawling tactics, and of course the famous bionic elbow, baby. Murdoch, on the other hand, was a slower brawler. He was more methodical. He also was one of the early proponents of the brainbuster suplex. And if you ever seen his is really, it's not as clean and as pretty as, say, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin's was, or currently like Austin Aries was, but it was pretty brutal. It was pretty brutal looking. So they're definitely a tag team that deserves to be remembered. Of course, Dick Murdoch passed away in 1996. So, and fortunately for us, Dusty Rhodes at this time that I'm making this video is still with us. And he still makes an appearance or two and is still very entertaining, even well past his wrestling prime. So, there's the Texas Outlaws, Rhodes and Murdoch. Now to another AWA-made tag team, the High Flyers, who you might remember as Jumping Jim Brunzell, who most fans like me mainly remember him as one half of the Killer Bees with B. Brian Blair in WWE, well then known as WWF. And of course Greg Gagne, the son of the legendary Vern Gagne. Greg Gagne, to me, he was an okay performer. He just never had what his dad had. He never had that charisma and that it factor that his father had. But he made a name for himself in tag teams. He had a pretty good tag team with the late Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig and several other guys. But his best known tag team partnership was with Jim Brunzell as the High Flyers. And their most famous feud was with another tag team who's not on this list, but I'm going to talk about him anyway. The East-West Connection, who people may remember as Jesse the Body Ventura, who later went on to become governor of Minnesota, and the late Adrian Adonis. Before he started wearing pink tights and leg warmers, this was a rugged guy from New York City, wearing leather jackets and hats. Kind of a Jim Belushi look-alike. And let me tell you, whether it is the effeminate, adorable Adrian Adonis, or whether as the rugged brawler from New York, he was a very great, good performer in the late 70s and 80s. Regardless of what gimmick you gave him, he always gave you a good match. But back to the High Flyers. They were early aerial tag team. They were an early aerial tag team. I mean, they weren't High Flyers in the way we think of now, like let's say the Hardy Boyz were in the late 90s, early 2000s, or even a more recent tag team such as the Motor City Machine Guns in TNA. They weren't High Flyers in that respect, but they were early pioneers for that high flying style in tag team wrestling. Moving on, the Andersons. Now, I have to admit, I know there was the tag team that was very over in the southeast of Ole and Gene Anderson, but the tag team of the Andersons that I'm going to discuss is Ole and Arn Anderson. Now, I remember when I first started watching the Mid-Atlantic area, which was a territory for the NWA, I remember watching these guys. Oh my Lord. You know, one time I was even asked, you know, just talking to friends, who would you have rather faced? Ole and Arn Anderson or the Road Warriors? I know people would think Ole and Arn Anderson, but believe it or not, I'd rather face the Road Warriors. And I'll tell you why right quick. The Road Warriors, tackle, power slam, military press slam, may get caught in the doomsday device, done. The Andersons, on the other hand, they like taking a body part and just beaming it until you give up, you know, submission. And quite honestly, that's just slow torture. If I'm going to get my ass whooped, I'd rather just get it over with. That's slow torture. Ugh. But Ole and Arn, they were a very super brutal tag team. And they were really, I know people talk about without Ric Flair, there is no Four Horsemen. That's true to a point. But I would say, especially that early group, without the Andersons, there was no Four Horsemen. Because let's face it, even though we knew they were tough, Tully Blanchard and Ric Flair were the guys you would look at and you'd be like, I could kick his ass. Or I can get in there and whoop his ass. But you look at the Andersons, you'd be like, I don't know about fighting them. I mean, they were that brutal backbone of the early Four Horsemen. And to me, without them, the Four Horsemen might not have gotten off the ground. Not to mention they were a successful tag team in their own right. Only helped with the development of Arn. And they were national tag team champions, which there really isn't a modern day equivalent, since most places only have one set of tag team belts instead of two. But that would have been the equivalent of, let's say, the later WCW United States tag team titles, or the Florida version of the United States tag team titles. That would have been that equivalent. The National Tag Team Championships has a very good and rich history in pro wrestling, particularly the Georgia Championship Wrestling area, which those belts will come up again later in this program. Now, moving on to another tag team Arn Anderson was very successful in, with fellow horseman Tully Blanchard. Now, Tully and Arn were a different tag team from Ole and Arn. Ole and Arn was the straight break you down, beat you till you cry, make you submit, or these days tap out. Tully and Arn were a different tag team. Arn was still the brutal Punisher. Tully was the more cerebral, not calling Arn stupid, by no means, but Tully was the more cerebral, sneaky, technical wrestler. He didn't have the strength and power that Arn did. But in a way, that's what made him so good, was there were things Tully could do that Arn, good as he was, couldn't do. And there was things that Arn could do that Tully couldn't do. And really, honestly, for a heel tag team, they really didn't cheat that much except manipulating the referee so they could get away with some dirty tactics. And like I said, they were very skilled tag teams. They're one of the few tag teams that can say, even though it wasn't by pin, they're one of the few tag teams that can say they have a victory over the Road Warriors. And not many teams can say that. I mean, they were, I think, 2-time NWA World Tag Team Champions, and they also went on with a run as the then WWF Tag Team Champions, defeating Demolition. After Demolition had held it for 18 months, which that in itself is a record. So Tully and Arn were a very good tag team. Not to mention they were part of the legendary Four Horsemen, which at one point, when they were tag team champions, Flair was the world heavyweight champion, and I think by that point Barry Windham had taken over the fourth slot. He was U.S. champion, and they held those belts all at the same time briefly during the summer months of 1988. So they were an integral part of the Four Horsemen, as well as Ole and Arn. So they definitely deserve to be on this best of the best list. Now, another one that's the best of the best: Ricky Morton, Robert Gibson, the Rock and Roll Express. Now, I have to admit, when I was younger, I was a fan of the faces. Of all faces. But as I got older, I gotta admit, these two, oh God. That image. I mean, I didn't outgrow wrestling, but I outgrew that image. I'm like, ugh. Somebody beat the crap out of these guys. But anyway, the Rock and Roll Express were a very good tag team, and much like the High Flyers, they were that early proponent of tag teams with a high-flying, fast-moving style. I think they started in the South. I'm not sure of their total history, but I do know they did work in the Mid-South and were very successful. Then they moved to the NWA Mid-Atlantic area, where they scored an upset win over the Russian trio, which composed of Ivan Koloff, who was former WWE champion, Nikita Koloff, his kayfabe nephew, real name was Scott Simpson, and Barry Darsow, who wrestled as Crusher Khrushchev and later Demolition Smash. I believe it was the duo of Ivan and Crusher defending the NWA Tag Team titles, because they had an angle which was often called the Freebird rule, which any two members of that three-man team could defend the titles. Well, in this one, the Rock and Roll Express, in one of their first appearances, scored an upset over Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev. Then, when that happened, it started a brief but very good feud. It was basically power and strength versus speed. And of course, the Russians would later regain the belts, but then the Rock and Rolls were regained for a second time at Starrcade '85, in which they regained the belts in a steel cage against Ivan and Nikita Koloff. And of course, they would have feuds with both versions of the Midnight Express. The first version they feuded with was Dennis Condrey and almost said Randy Orton, Beautiful Bobby Eaton. And then later they would feud with Dennis Condrey with not Dennis Condrey, Sweet Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton. And also, I'm not for sure, but I think they even took on the original Midnight Express too. And that team was comprised of Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose. And I'll get more into the history of the Midnight Express later on. And of course, they also had some other high-profile matches. They had one high-profile match with the British Bulldogs. I forgot who they wrestled for that match, though. They're a very legendary tag team. Of course, Ricky Morton went through some both professional and personal changes. Him and Robert Gibson, I think they got together a few times for like a reunion show or something, but you really didn't see that much of them, after about 1999, when they made their brief appearance in WWE, which I think they made one too in 1993 when they worked for Smoky Mountain against the Heavenly Bodies on one of WWE's Survivor Series pay-per-views. But Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson definitely deserve to be one of the best, and they definitely influenced a high-flying style. Now next, the Fabulous Freebirds. Of course, when you discuss the Fabulous Freebirds, I will go into the version with Jimmy Garvin and Michael Hayes, but only briefly. I'm mainly going to talk about the team of Hayes, Gordy, and the late Terry Gordy and Buddy Jack Roberts. Of course, Michael Hayes, their most famous feud was, of course, with the Von Erich family down in Texas from 1982 to really 1984. I know they feuded a few times after that, but really, if you want the best of the Von Erich Freebird feuds, that was the best period. Look it up on YouTube. I even have one match that I discussed from that feud in my Lost Classics series. Go look that up. And I even have a link to the match that I'm talking about. But that was their strongest period. These guys could play face or heel. And Michael Hayes, I felt, was underrated as a talker, because he was probably one of the best talkers out there. Definitely one of the most underrated. I almost said overrated. Underrated talkers out there. He was not the greatest wrestler. I think both Buddy Jack Roberts and Terry Gordy were much better performers than Michael Hayes. But when it came to selling the Freebirds, whether as faces or as heels, Michael Hayes, there were maybe a handful that were better talkers than him on the mic. He was very, very good on the mic. And they held several titles throughout their careers. I think their biggest title was actually, by that time, Jim Garvin had joined the group. I think their biggest title was the NWA World Tag Team Championship They won it in 1989 in a tournament final where they defeated the Midnight Express duo of Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton. Jim Garvin and Michael Hayes was an okay team, but it just didn't have that cool Southern rock feel that Hayes, Gordy, and Roberts had. I think they were trying to get away from that, and it was okay, but for me, it just wasn't the same. Just wasn't the same at all to me. But the Freebirds are definitely one of the best tag teams ever. Now, moving on to the next duo, Hawk Animal with Precious Paul Ellery, the Legion of Doom, otherwise known as the Road Warriors. Now, these guys had to be two of the stiffest, most brutal guys out there, at least early in their career. About 3 or 4 years ago, I saw that DVD WWE put out, and I watched that, and I watched some of the hits they would give the people they work with, and oh my God, sometimes I thought the dudes were dead, or they should have been. These guys were no joke in the ring. Hawk, of course, Michael Hegstrand, he was very, very stiff. In fact, many times, and I remember Arn Anderson talking about this in an interview, many times they worried that one day he was going to military press somebody, and instead of slamming them on their back, he was going to just drop them on their head. Ironically, Hawk was the more popular of the two Road Warriors. He was certainly the more charismatic. Not saying that Animal or Precious Paul were not, but Hawk was certainly the more standout and charismatic of that threesome. Animal, on the other hand, he was a good talker. He wasn't quite as charismatic as Hawk, but he was okay on the mic. He was certainly a better worker. And the reputation I used to hear on the Road Warriors was that Hawk was more popular, but Animal was the one, if the wrestlers, if you talk to them privately under an anonymity, they would say Animal was the one they preferred to work with, because Animal was more, and you could see it if you look at those matches. Animal was more crisp, more professional. He made his stuff look brutal, but he would make sure the other guy was protected, whereas Hawk basically didn't give a damn. Basically, if you didn't protect yourself with Hawk, you're just shit out of luck. But as far as their influence on the sport, I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. NWA Georgia National Tag Team Champions. They practically revived that title when it was kind of dying, and I mean, it ultimately did die, but for a time they really revived that title. Then to the AWA, where they was AWA World Tag Team Champions, where they played both face and heel. They were heels initially, but then later on they somehow turned face. And the interesting part was they did not change one thing in their style at all, but fans were cheering them. Then, of course, back to the NWA, they were NWA six-man tag team champions with Dusty Rhodes. They were the first winners of the Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Cup tournament back in '86. And, of course, they finally won the NWA World Tag Team Championships. They finally won that in 1988. Then they moved to WWE, where after a year, they showed up in 1990, and after 1 year, they won the WWE World Tag Team Championships. In fact, I think they've held those belts, I could be mistaken, I think 2 occasions. And they had some pretty good matches. One match I remember in particular is against the Nasty Boys at SummerSlam '91, where they actually defeated them to become WWE Tag Team Champions. That was a very, very good match. I would have to say that was probably the highlight of their WWE run. Now, of course, as we now know, Hawk died in 2003 after getting clean and sober for a few years, but unfortunately the damage he did with his wild partying and drug use did take its toll on Michael Hegstrand. So before I move on, let me say rest in peace, Hawk. Hope you chilling in heaven. Now to the next tag team, Ivan and Nikita Koloff. Now I know Crusher Khrushchev, Barry Darsow was part of this group duo as well, but I tend to focus on just Ivan and Nikita because they tend to be the most intertwined of the two. Of course, it was Nikita that was brought in by Ivan, and for a long time, this duo really worked. You had Ivan, who was a bit of a power man in his younger days too, but he could wrestle. And Ivan had a name. He was the man that finally ended Bruno Sammartino's 8.5-year run as WWF World Champion, the title we now know as WWE Championship. He ended an 8.5-year run. So Ivan already had a name, and backstage he was a well-respected individual and a very gentleman. And a good gentleman from what I understand. Nikita, Christopher Simpson, was brought in under Ivan's wing, and while not the greatest technical wrestler, man, he was stiff. And it was believable when he would knock the crap out of you. It was very believable because he had the physique of a god at the time. And these two basically wrecked shop during the tag team division. They were very dominant NWA World Tag Team Champions. And while they weren't together for that long, they made an impact in that division. Of course, later Ivan was more put in the role of trying to get Nikita ready for the singles, for a singles run. He was more into that. Of course, with the feud with Magnum TA that culminated in the Best of 7 series for the U.S. title. Of course, his later matches with Ric Flair. But I have to say that his team with Ivan Koloff was very special, and I think they deserve to be mentioned. Moving on, the Midnight Express with Jim Cornette. Now here I'm going to discuss. Actually, I'm going to discuss 3 different versions of the Midnight Express. The first version is Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose, which actually was a 3-man duo. It was Condrey Rose and a black wrestler named Norval Austin were the original Midnight Express. Of course, Norval Austin later broke away from that group, so it was just Condrey and Rose. But then when Condrey showed up in Mid-South, they put him together with a wrestler named Bobby Eaton and put the manager Jim Cornette together. And they were a very, very good duo. I would have to say, even though Bobby was a high flyer in both duos, I have to say the Midnight Express of Condrey and Eaton was the most brutal of them. They were more of a brawling team there, even though Bobby did add the element of high flying and good double team. And of course, Condrey, you know that skull cracking finale that the Miz uses now? Dennis Condrey used a similar move back in those days too. It was very similar to the skull cracking finale that the Miz used now. Of course, they held the Mid-South Tag Team titles. They also held the World Class Tag Team Championship with a good feud with the Fantastics. And of course, they held the NWA World Tag Team Championships. Later, Condrey left and was replaced by Stan Lane, who had also been part of a very successful duo, the Fabulous Ones, with Steve Keirn. So I noticed I'm mentioning a lot of other tag teams that are actually not on this list as well. So, whew. Makes you, that alone, I mean, I'm only at my 10th team, and that alone just tells you how depleted tag team wrestling is, at least in the United States. Very depleted. But anyway, back on point. The team of Lane and Eaton were a faster tag team. Very, very quick. And very innovative with their offense. They were the United States Tag Team Champions for a long time. United States Tag Team Champions, I might add. They had an okay run against the Rock and Roll Express, but their big feuds, in my opinion, were against the original Midnight Express when they showed up, Condrey and Randy Rose, with Paul Lee Dangerously, Paul Heyman. And also they had a very, very hot feud with the Fantastics, the team of Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers, over those U.S. belts. Their biggest achievement was when they won the NWA World Tag Team Championship from Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson, while still holding the U.S. Tag Team titles, which made them the first team to hold both of those belts simultaneously. Now, of course, you know, in later years, they would have reunions together. Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane would reunite on, like, the independent circuit here and there. And Bobby Eaton even reunited with Dennis Condrey on the independent. And I think there was one card that I read about once where Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Dennis Condrey teamed together. Which, that would be interesting to see. If anyone's got that match, I'd like to see it. But yeah, the Midnight Express, of course, there was that one in WWE of, but that's Bodacious Bob and Bombastic Bart. Ugh. Very forgettable, by the way. I'm not even mentioning them. As far as I'm concerned, there's only 3 real Midnight Expresses. Condrey Rose, Condrey Eaton Lane. That's all you need to know about the Midnight Express. Moving on. Matt and Jeff Hardy, the Hardy Boyz. Now, before they became basically faking suicides and showing up to matches stoned, Matt and Jeff Hardy were a really, really good tag team. One of the best and most innovative in the late 90s through the earlier part of this decade and even the middle part of this decade. They've really got their first big break whenever they teamed them with Freebird Michael Hayes. And then later, Gangrel as part of the Brood. They actually won under Hayes. They actually won the WWE World Tag Team Championships from no less than the Acolytes, the team of Farouk and Bradshaw, before his JBL days. Bradshaw at the time, you know, was more of a brawler. There wasn't much psychology. The same with Farouk. So most considered it an upset when the Hardys beat them for the championships. Then the Hardys would go on to their classic feud with Edge and Christian, which culminated in that 5-match series they had in 1999, which ended with their ladder match, which was almost a prelude to what was to come later. As a matter of fact, the next 2 tag teams I'm going to mention after I talk about the Hardy Boyz are, in fact, the Dudley Boyz and Edge and Christian. But back to the Hardys. They would go on to win tag team titles again in WWE, both the WWE version and the WWE-owned WCW tag team titles as well. Of course, they had their successes individually. Matt Hardy won the now defunct European title. Jeff won the now defunct light heavyweight title on his own. Of course, Matt Hardy also was Cruiserweight, WWE Cruiserweight champion. He also went on to win the WWE-owned ECW title. And Jeff, as we know, would win the Intercontinental Championship. I think Matt also held the United States title as well. They both would end up winning another World Tag Team title in 2007 when they reunited briefly while working for the two different brands in WWE. And of course, Jeff would go on to win the WWE World title and the World Heavyweight Championship. So while they have, but you know what? For me, for all their successes on their own, to me, I'll best remember them as a team. And I hope they really get their lives straightened out. Because, man, what a mess. Moving on, the Dudley Boyz. What's interesting to note about the Dudley Boyz, the Dudleys, or Team 3D, as we know them now, did not start out that way. The Dudley Boyz originally was a comedy gimmick. I mean, you had all these different guys that was like, all these different Dudleys. But then, when they brought in Devon and Bubba Ray Dudley, they started giving them more of a heel edge. And they were easily the most hated team, the most hated wrestlers in the original ECW. They got so much heat, they'd cause near riots in ECW. And of course, they were dominant ECW World Tag Team Championships. Even when they did lose the titles, they weren't without them for long. Then they moved on to WWE and quickly won the WWE World Tag Team titles, and were innovators with the ladder match. Of course, Shawn Michaels is credited as innovating the ladder match in WWE, but I think they, along with Edge and Christian and the Hardys, took it to the next level, especially with the TLC matches, to the point where now today TLC has its own pay-per-view. So they were innovators on that. They held both the Raw and SmackDown versions of the WWE Tag Team Championships. And they did go on to win not only the NWA TNA version of the World Tag Team titles, but when TNA established its own champions, I think they held those belts as well. So they're among the most honored tag teams, decorated teams out there ever. Of course, you had Bubba Ray with his more both of them were brawlers, but I think Bubba Ray was more of the real brawler of the two, while Devon was more of a, he could go to the air as well as brawl. So this is a very influential tag team. And moving on to two guys who went on to great success on their own, but they're best remembered for their team too, Edge and Christian. Now, of course, they first started teaming. Of course, Edge actually showed up in WWE first after some stints on the independent circuit. He shows up first, and he makes a splash on his own. He actually won, I believe, the Intercontinental Championship in 1999. Only held it for 2 days briefly after winning and then later losing it back to Jeff Jarrett. And that was probably some Russo booking there, but Edge would later team with Christian when they brought in Christian as his kayfabe brother, and they would go on with a run to a tag team. Now at WrestleMania 2000, the Triangle Ladder match with Edge and Christian versus the Hardy Boyz versus the Dudleys, I gotta be honest, I viewed Edge and Christian's win as an upset, just simply because I believed either the Dudleys would retain or the Hardys would win. So when Edge and Christian came out of nowhere and won it, I have to admit that was a bit of an upset to me. But they proved to be good champions, very good heel champions, I might add. And they would hold the belts several times before splitting on their own. I won't go into their individual accomplishments other than to say we all know about them, especially Edge. But Edge and Christian were a very entertaining tag team, both as face and heels, but more so as heels. And I think everybody remembers sorry about that little interruption. That was my mom. I had to answer that phone. Anyway, Edge and Christian definitely deserves to be on a best of the best list. Now moving on. Here's a tag team. Sadly, both members are deceased, but they're still pretty remembered. The team of Dr. Death, Steve Williams, and Freebird, Terry Bam Bam Gordy, otherwise known overseas as the Miracle Violence Connection. Now, what's interesting, these two had great matches as opponents, particularly in the UWF and during the latter days of the NWA before it was switched over to WCW in '89. So when I heard they had brought these two together as a tag team, I was like, that's interesting. And the first time I saw them, I was like, impressive. The first time I ever saw them was in 1982 when they brought them over from Japan to challenge the Steiner Brothers, who I'll discuss in a bit. The Steiners at that time were the most dominant tag team in WCW, and really, save some injuries, they have not yet They put them together in 1989, and by 1992, they've only lost maybe a couple of times, but both of those was by screw jobs. So when they brought Terry Gordy and Steve Williams in, I figured, oh, it'd probably be a good match and everything. First time I saw these guys lock up, Beach Blast, 92. Dr. Death, Steve Williams, and Terry Bam Bam Gordy versus the Steiners. Oh man, I had never up until that point seen a team just beat the hell out of the Steiners like Gordy and Williams did. I mean, they practically destroyed these guys. They made them look like jobbers. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, the Steiners got in some offense, but oh man, I hope this match is on YouTube because I really want people to see this one. Really do. But they were very dominant in All Japan Pro Wrestling overseas, and they were dominant here in the United States as they won the WCW and the Japanese owned NWA version of the World Tag Team titles. So, and they held those belts at the same time, so that just tells you what kind of team they were. So, moving on, speaking of the Steiner Brothers, the Steiners, Rick and Scott, for those of you that only know Scott as Big Papa Pump, you need to go back and find some matches from the late 80s and early 90s. Because at one time, this man not only was big and strong, but he was a phenomenal athlete. And with his brother Rick, who was no slouch himself, he really wrecked shop. He and Rick really wrecked shop in the tag team division. I mean, even when they got beat, up until Williams and Gordy, even when they got beat, it was usually by some screw job. And the opposite team was basically fighting for their lives against them. I mean, they were so dominant that at one point they held the NWA World Tag Team titles, which was WCW World Tag Team titles by then, the WCW United States Tag Team titles, and the IWGP Tag Team titles. That's how dominant these guys were. So this team I really miss because they had innovative offense such as Rick holding a guy on the shoulders while Scott DDTs him off of it, or Scott holding a guy on the shoulders while Rick bulldogs him off the top rope from that like doomsday device position. Whew. And Rick Steiner line, oh yeah, his clothesline from those days it needs to be seen to be believed. It was awesome. And moving on, I'm going even further back. Now everyone knows about Ricky the Dragon Steamboat as a singles wrestler, and rightfully so. But I'm here to talk about a little part that's rarely talked about, and that was his legendary tag team with Jay Youngblood. And I'm glad in Steamboat's recent WWE solo release, I'm glad this came back up, because this was an integral part of his career too. Steamboat and Jay Youngblood were a very good tag team. I think they were 5-time NWA World Tag Team Champions, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, the one match I definitely remember me personally, is their match against the Briscoes at the very first Starrcade. And it was a very good match. It actually showed, it was actually a very good wrestling match. But Steamboat and Youngblood, from what I've seen of them, I mean, I don't know that much about them, interestingly enough. I heard their most high-profile match was against the team of Don Cronoodle and Sergeant Slaughter for the NWA tag titles. And it was in a cage. And I hope I could see that match one day, because I would love to see it. But this is an often forgotten part of Ricky Steamboat's career. Jay Youngblood, of course, sadly he died about a couple of years after Steamboat had gone to then WWF. So they definitely deserve to be on this list for sure. And if you've never seen them together, look up the Steamboat Youngblood match versus the Briscoes. I'm sure it's on YouTube. It's probably very easy to find. Now moving on, next is the British Bulldogs. David Smith, better known as Davey Boy Smith, and Tom Billington, better known as the Dynamite Kid. A man that would go on to influence a lot of wrestlers, most notably Chris Benoit. Now the British Bulldogs, as a team, they were very, very over, not only in WWE but internationally as well. The duo, basically, while both men were strong and powerful, Dynamite Kid was easily the quicker of the two, while Davey Boy was more of the power man. Their combination of speed and power made them a very, very difficult tag team to deal with. To be honest, and I understand it was more backstage politics than anything, it's amazing, as good as this duo was, they only had one run as WWE World Tag Team Champions. Of course, Davey Boy would go on in later years to win those particular belts as well, but he, as with the Dynamite Kid, they only had one run. You would have thought they would have had several. But they're definitely an influential tag team, and definitely one that I remember. And moving on, Demolition, Axe and Smash. I'm not going to really talk about the trio with Crush. I'm mostly focused on Axe and Smash. Now, these guys were often labeled, and even today are still labeled, as nothing but Road Warrior ripoffs. Well, let's be honest, they were. But they were very good Road Warrior ripoffs, and in a way, they did their own thing. Yeah, they did the ground and pound just like the Road Warriors did. But they were more of a wrestling team. And Axe and Smash were good in their own right. They held the WWE World Tag Team titles and held them for almost 18 months. I mean, they were so and that's back when the tag team pool was good. They beat Strikeforce, Rick Martel, Tito Santana, They even beat the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart a few times. They beat the Killer Bees. They beat the British Bulldogs. They beat the Powers of Pain, which, quite honestly, other than the fact they were bigger than Demolition, they were not very good workers. With Demolition, they made Demolition look like the Harts. I mean, that's how bad they were working. And Demolition, it finally took the late Andre the Giant and two members of the Four Horsemen of Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson to finally get the belts off of them. And I think they did have two more runs as the WWE Tag Team Championship. The last one being at WrestleMania 6 when they won them from Andre the Giant and Haku. And it ended at SummerSlam, but it was actually not Axe and Smash that lost those. It was actually Smash and Crush. And it kind of was disappointing that Axe was not involved that much, because what I really wanted to see, and we never got to see it, was Axe and Smash versus Hawk and Animal. That's the matchup, but we ended up with Smash and Crush against Hawk and Animal, which, I don't know, it just wasn't the same. But Demolition, I believe, was one of the better tag teams, and to me, they should be on this list. Now, next, the Hart Foundation. Of course, I'm talking about Bret the Hitman Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart. A very good tag team, both as face and heel. Of course, you had the Power Man with Jim the Anvil Neidhart. He had all the personality. But the ring general was definitely Bret Hart. I mean, he has the ego the size of Mount Everest, but you got to give the man his due. He definitely was the workhorse of the team. And I think they held the WWE Tag Team titles twice. And they did team back up a few times during that whole Hart Foundation thing when they added Brian Pillman, the late Brian Pillman, the late Davey Boy Smith, and of course the late great Owen Hart to their tandem. They but here I'm talking about mainly Bret and Jim. I mean, they were very good. They were a very good heel tag team at a time when there was still plenty of tag teams. And they pretty much were a prominent team on and off from about 1985 till 1991. So that's a good stretch to be a team on and off. So, and of course, Bret would go on to his Hall of Fame greatness that we know of him now. And of course, Jim the Anvil made his own contribution in a way. We got Natalya Neidhart now. So he made his own small contribution. But definitely one of the better tag teams. And now the last one, I mean, I could go on maybe for another 30 minutes to an hour, but I'm going to wrap this up with one last team and then some quick honorable mentions. The Rockers. Now, the Rockers, of course, as we know, is Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels. Of course, these two started actually in the AWA. And of course, at that point, they were called the Midnight Rockers. They held the AWA World Tag Team titles twice. And then after going there and getting fired, they came back to WWE, and this time it took. They never really got the chance to be WWE Tag Team Champions, although there is video evidence of them winning the titles, but it was later reversed on them. And the match never made TV. In fact, it was never even shown until recently with one of Shawn Michaels' video sets called Heartbreak and Triumph. Was the first time it was actually shown. So it's too bad they didn't get a run with the Tag Team Championship. I think they would have made interesting WWE Tag Team Champions. Of course, we know what happened with Shawn Michaels after that duo broke up. So no need to go into that. But I think they were the best of the best. I mean, their matches with the Hart Foundation, Demolition, the Rougeaus, and they had some brief but good matches with Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson, which they credit a lot, and they say that taught them a lot. Shawn Michaels, I know, credits those matches. So now to some honorable mentions. Let's go with the Nasty Boys. Now, Brian Knobbs and Jerry Sags was never the prettiest team to look at. They were never pretty as far as in-the-ring skill or even with brawling. But they certainly were two of the toughest. They certainly were one of the toughest tag teams I've ever seen. Jerry Sags, I remember one match against the Rock and Roll Express where he actually tried a Stinger Splash in the corner. I think it was Rick Morton. He moved, but Jerry Sags had overshot his target anyway, shall we say. He landed face first into the ring post, legitimately. And when Sags got up, he was bleeding from the mouth, his jaw, and everything was open. Ugh. But he finished the match. I was like, that's a tough motherfucker right there. But yeah, and the Nasty Boys also had some very stiff and brutal matches with the Steiners in 1990 in WCW. And of course, they would go on to hold their share of belts. They would hold the WWE Tag Team Championships. They would also hold the WCW World Tag Team Championships on several occasions before pretty much disappearing after the mid-90s as a team. Of course, they had their brief comeback in TNA, which I don't know what they were I don't know what TNA was smoking on that, but basically, Knobbs and Sags deserves a shout out. Now to a duo that was only briefly together, but I kind of like this team, and they still hold a place with me, and that is the Canadian Chris's, being Y2J Chris Jericho and the Wolverine Chris Benoit. Of course, they put these two together after being opponents for several years. They put these two together briefly in 2001 when Jericho and Benoit were both getting jerked around by then on-screen Commissioner William Regal. And then they went on to actually beat Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H for the WWE Tag Team Championships in front of a hometown, I think it was in front of a hometown crowd of in Canada. I'm not for sure. I mean, if anyone knows the information, let me know. But they had a brief but pretty good title reign, actually. And I like this duo for one reason. Benoit, of course, was a strong technical wrestler. So was Jericho. But Jericho was better on the mic, and he had more personality, and could play off Benoit's stiffness, which actually made for good entertainment. So, and they still hold a place because these were these two guys who basically were battling for big positions. I think they also had a running thing 2-on-1 with Stone Cold at that point. Of course, during that was the famous 10 German suplexes in the row from Benoit onto Stone Cold. And of course, that's when the first appearance of the cross-face Boston Crab Walls of Jericho combination submission hold, which they slapped on Austin on at least one occasion. And very painful looking. But yeah, I think these two deserve an honorable mention. Both men have been in other entertaining tag teams, but as far as tag teams go, unless you're talking about Benoit and Kurt Angle, I think this was probably the best tag team he was ever in with Jericho. It's just too bad it was just short. Now, Los Guerreros, the team of Eddie Guerrero and his nephew Chavo. Yeah, those two were very entertaining. I mean, I still got some of their skits off of Cheat Death and Stealing Life, the Eddie Guerrero story. Oh man, those two was hilarious. both as champions and just a tag team. I mean, what a phenomenal tag team they were, and what an entertaining team they were. Now, here comes Barry Windham, and I'm going to mention him in two teams. First one is with Mike Rotunda, which is pretty much his more legendary team. He teamed with Mike Rotunda down in Florida, and they held the United States Tag Team Championship down there. They also were WWE World Tag Team Champions. And I think they may have challenged for the NWA, or at least tried to, the NWA World Tag Team Championships. And they even teamed together a few times while in different groups in the NWA. I remember a few times they actually teamed together. Mike Rotunda, who was World Television Champion at that point, was with the Varsity Club with Kevin Sullivan and Rick Steiner, while Barry Windham was, of course, part of the Four Horsemen, but they would put their alliances aside and actually team together. Of course, as we know, in real life, Mike Rotunda is married to Barry Windham's sister. So they've been good friends on and off camera for years. And, of course, they're family. And, of course, Barry Windham is the uncle of Mike Rotunda's son, who you might know as Husky Harris. So this was a pretty good tag team. I wouldn't rank them as best of the best, but they are important. They are legendary, especially in Windham's career, as far as the development of Barry Windham. Now, Barry Windham's other tag team that I really remember and was really fond of was his team with Dustin Rhodes, the son of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, who would later go on to become Goldust. That team had great potential. I think their best time together was in 1992, when they teamed through the summer and through the fall months. I mean, these two were excellent. I mean, whether in win or lose, you knew you was going to get a good match when you saw them together. And they actually won the Unified World Tag Team Championships, I believe, at one point. And they defeated, no less, Steve Williams and Terry Gordy for those titles. And at Halloween Havoc 92, they, in my opinion, pretty much saved. They saved that card, in my opinion. Because without them in there, that card would have sucked ass. They took on Steve Williams and Steve Austin. And in case you're wondering, yes, I mean the guy that would become Stone Cold, Steve Austin. They teamed with them. They went up against them. And I think it ended in a draw. But they were a tag team I was really fond of, with the Lariats, the Bulldogs. And basically you had the potential rookie in Rhodes, and you had the veteran in Windham. So I think that's why that team worked. Then we have one that, I know some viewers are going to listen to this and probably say they should be among best of the best. And I tend to agree. Actually, I'm going to call them best of the best. Harlem Heat. That's the team, of course, Stevie Ray, and of course the five-time WCW champion, Booker T. Now these two were definitely a great tag team, as they start out in global championship wrestling, where they held the global tag team titles. And then they would move to WCW, and after a couple of years languishing there, they would hold the WCW version of the World Tag Team titles on several occasions. Of course, Booker T would go on to single success with the television championship. His legendary Best of 7 series for that title against Chris Benoit. And of course the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. He would go on to those things. While Stevie Ray, he would go on to a good career, but he decided to bow out of wrestling He was content with outside the ring, so good for him. But these two were definitely influential. Not to mention, and not that it's too big of a deal with me, but I think they were the only other all-black tag team to hold the WCW Tag Team Championships, other than the Team of Doom. They were the Team of Doom, which was Ron Simmons and Butch Reed. Now, moving on to Steve Austin and Brian Pillman, better known as the Hollywood Blondes. Now, the reason they're in honorable mentions and not in my best of the best is because they didn't have a long enough stretch, in my opinion, to be considered best of the best, which is not their fault. It's more WCW's fault, because these two, they basically put them together to have good matches with people. They never intended them to get over, but they did, in spite of what WCW wanted. And WCW at the time were too damn narrow-minded to realize what they had, and decided to split them up. Of course, it ended up working out better for Steve than Brian, but eventually both of them got ate up by the WCW machine. But for the time they were together, they were very entertaining and a very good tag team. You had Steve the Brawler, who had some scientific skills, but then you had Pillman the High Flyer, who was decidedly sneakier and more scientific with his approach. But together, they were tremendous heels. I can remember when they took on Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. The things they would do that pissed them off were hilarious. Especially that time on Flair for the Gold, or their little segment called A Flair for the Old. Oh, God. Oh, if you ever find that segment, watch it. It is wrestling gold. But these two definitely deserve a mention. Had they been kept together longer and had more success, I would have probably put them in best of the best. But I think I would be remiss not to mention them entirely. They definitely deserve mention. Which, by the way, Mr. Pillman, hope you're rested in peace. And I hope you're with your daughter, who sadly died a couple of years ago too. I believe she was the stepdaughter on Brian Pillman's video, Melanie. Very sad, and prayers to that family too. Well, I hope during this ramble about the tag teams, you got some good points during it. And I'm sure I will get comments on it. I'm sure there's some teams I probably didn't think of or I entirely missed. So let me know what you think. Hope you stuck around for this hour and change of a rant, I should say. Well, see you.